Let's work on our last project here, number 4. So we're going to open up 2 different files at once. So we'll open up the start file, and then we'll open up the beach image here. So there's a couple different ways. We're going to actually combine these. We want to bring this beach image over into the start file. So we can do that a couple different ways. One cool thing that you wouldn't necessarily use in order to do this process, but is handy for if you have multiple files open at once, is to go to Window, Arrange, at the very top, and then we'll do 2 up vertical. So you can see there's more options here. If you had 3, 4, 6 files open, we're going to do 2 up vertical, and you can see it shows both of these tabs side by side now. And I can actually click over to the beach document, use the move tool, that very first tool, the crosshairs with the arrows, click and just drag it over and let go. And now it's over there. I can close beach, and I've got this layer now combined with my pineapple. I'm going to double click this and rename this to beach photo and hide it. Another couple simple ways to do that, as long as you're able to see your Photoshop document and your files, you can actually just click drag and drop, and it should drop it right in there. So I'm going to get rid of that one, and we're actually going to start with this beach photo. And once again, we've gone over how to show and hide layers. A couple quick shortcuts there. If you only wanted to see this one single layer, if you hold Option on Mac or Alt on Windows, and while holding that, click on the eyeball next to the only layer you want to see, it'll show only that layer. If I click it again while holding Option or Alt, it goes back to showing whatever it was showing before. So if for some reason we only had those showing, but I only want to see beach, I hold Option or Alt, tap. If I tap it one more time, it goes right back. Not everything, just exactly what was showing before. So let's only show our beach layer for now, and we're going to use what's called a layer style, something we have not done before. So we're going to add a border or an outline to this. It's actually referred to as a stroke in Photoshop. So go up to your top menu here and go to Layer, Layer Style, and then we're going to do stroke. You get this new dialog box, and in here these are all the different sort of layer styles you can add. So I'm going to zoom in here so you can see a little bit better. We're going to add a white stroke that's 5 pixels wide to this. So my size in pixels, that's where we would type in 5. You can also use the slider here to adjust. So 5 pixels wide. And you can also adjust the position. So if I want it inside, it's going to start covering up the edges of that beach photo. So if I go large, it's just going to keep cutting into that photo farther and farther. If I go center, it'll go half in, half out. And then if I go outside, obviously it'll all be outside. And no matter how large I make it, it's not going to cover up any of the photo. For this one, the book has us do inside. Either inside or outside, shouldn't really matter much. And then we're going to adjust the color. So as we've done a million times, this is just in a different spot. Click on that swatch, and then we can drag and adjust the color to whatever you like. We'll go with white for now. We'll click OK, and click OK again. So now let's turn on the pineapple layer here down below. So we'll just hit the eyeball there. And we're actually just going to drag this beach photo layer down and adjust it or rearrange it so that it's right above the pineapple layer. So we're going to go ahead now and turn on this postage layer right here. Let me go back to seeing the whole thing. And we're going to adjust the opacity. So we worked with this just a little bit in our first class. So opacity for each layer is listed at the top of your layers panel. So if I use the slider, I drop this down in opacity, and I click to flower. Flower is set to 100% opacity. If I click back to the beach photo that I just changed, you can see it's individual layer by layer. That one's still at 28% opacity. But we're going to jump up to this postage layer, and we're going to adjust the opacity down to about 25%. Once again, like everything we've done, you can use the slider. You can come up here and type the number in. You can also click, hold, and drag and sort of scrub to the size that you want, whatever's easiest. Scrubbing can be helpful if you want to pause and stop and see what does 30 look like, what does 70 look like, that kind of a thing. Typing, if you happen to know about where you want it, that's usually the fastest way. So let's go ahead and save our work. So I'm just going to go Command Shift S or Control Shift S on a PC to save, and I'm just going to change this to a new name. You can save it under whatever name you want. Just make sure that it's a Photoshop document, PSD file. It should default to that since we have layers in here. So now we're going to look at a new feature called Blend Mode. And on our pineapple layer, we're going to create a duplicate of it. So we've done that before. So once again, you can either right click and choose duplicate layer and just hit OK. And we've got our duplicate. You can also, I'm just going to delete that. You can also click and drag the layer you want to duplicate and drop it on the new layer button at the bottom of your layers panel, just to the left of the trash icon, the little square with a plus. Either way works totally fine. So up here, right next to opacity, every single one of these layers has what's called a blend mode, and it always defaults to normal. So as we click this drop down and we hover over these, you'll be able to see what each of these blend modes does. How this image of the pineapple is going to interact with all the layers below it, which right now is just an image of the other pineapple here. So some of these get pretty crazy, things you'd probably never want to do. We're going to actually use overlay, and so you guys can see a little better, I'm going to hide those other two layers for now. And that just adds some contrast. And I'm going to turn on my white background again, even though we're going to add a background here in a minute. But I think that's a little bit too contrasty for me. So I'm going to bring my opacity down just a little bit on that, just so it's not so crazy. Maybe we'll go up a little bit, maybe in the 50 to 60 range, something like that. So to me, this is a good demonstration of blend modes, of what it does. You know, every time you hover over one of these, it'll show you kind of what each one does. And I covered this a little bit in the homework, adjusting the color on the doors and the garage doors of the house. Personally, this is not the way. If I wanted my pineapple to be darker and more contrasty or something more colorful, I prefer more literal approaches, just because if I opened this file and saw these two layers, I would not think, oh, they're using overlay blend mode in order to make the pineapple more contrasty. I would have to click on these and read this small text to find out what they were doing and why, or sit here and turn them off and see, okay, I see what it's doing. Now how and why is it doing that? I'm going to leave this here and we'll go with the way the book has it, but to me I would prefer a more literal approach, so something more like adding a curves or levels layer and using a curve or levels to adjust the contrast, and then if I thought I needed more color, just adding a hue saturation layer and bringing the saturation up to wherever I wanted it. Just because when I glance, I open this file, it's brand new to me, I can see, okay, hue saturation, they're adjusting how much color is there or what color's there. I look at curves, I know they're adjusting the brightness or contrast. So to me, that would be a better way to approach that, or at least a more literal, more clear way to approach that. But this is a good demonstration of how different blend modes do different things. As we said, you can hover over these and get a quick preview of what each one of them does. All right, so let's change, let's go back to the beach photograph. So I think yours is about like that. If you turn them on or off with me, just turn back on your beach photo and your postage layer. And let's go back to our beach photo here. Make sure that layer is selected in your layers panel. And we're going to transform this. So once again, you can use the keyboard shortcut Command T or Control T on PC, or come up here, go Edit, and then Free Transform. And we get our bounding box again. So once again with this, has some of the functionality of the Move tool built in, with transforming, resizing, all of that built in as well. So we're going to resize this to about 50%. You can use the percentages up here and type in, or you can just use them visually. So I'm just going to drop down to somewhere in the 50% range. And we are going to also rotate this, and the book says 15 degrees. You can do whatever looks good to you, or you can come up here in this sort of angle and you can type in 15 and hit enter, and you'll get your 15 degrees exactly. And then we're going to reposition this image underneath our postage stamp, so you can kind of see the shape of the postage stamp. I would just put the upper left corner kind of right dead center. Then once again, you can either click the check mark to confirm this transformation or hit the enter key. If you decided you didn't like it, you could use that little circle with the X through it in order to start over, or just cancel out of it, or hit the escape key. So from here, let's do this. We're gonna add one more new file to this. So you could go the long way, bringing up two files, then tiling them side by side, dragging over. To me, it's always just easier to be able to see everything, drag a new file in and drop it. So we've added in our flower, and let's do this. Let's turn off our flower real quick and come back down to our background layer. So select your background layer, add a new blank layer, so just this square with a plus, and you'll get a new layer, and we're going to actually create some fake clouds. So I'm going to rename that layer to clouds. And let's go up to filter, render, and then clouds, just about halfway down. And you'll see that depending on what your foreground and background colors are is what it's going to use to render the clouds. So mine are black and white, it rendered black and white. So let's go back and change that. We want white clouds, that's perfect, that's great. But let's adjust to a blue color. So let's do something here, maybe something more bright, kind of baby blue, hit OK, we'll see how that looks. And let's go back up to File, Render, and Clouds one more time, and see what we get. And I think that looks pretty good. So that just kind of generates fake clouds for us. If you were using this on a whole image to replace the sky, it's really not going to look realistic. You'd probably want to take a different photograph of a sky that you liked that's from the same sort of angle of view, same position of the camera, standing up or looking down on something, and match those up from there rather than using this. But this works for a nice background here. So now let's go to the flower again. So let's turn back on that one we just dropped in, flower number 2. And here's just a quick side note. You'll see that when we do combine images or combine files, when we drag and drop in like that, it puts it in with this little icon here, and that just means it's a smart object. So to demonstrate what that means, let me create a duplicate here. So I have two versions of this. And a smart object can be rasterized, and that'll make more sense here in a second. So I have two versions, and let me do this. Let me put them side by side so you can kind of see. So the benefits of using a smart object is it keeps all of the resolution of the original file no matter what you do with it. You can shrink it, then make it large again and stretch it back out, and it keeps all the original information of how large it was to begin with. That doesn't mean that if it's this large that I can just make it this large and it's going to look great. It's just going to keep the resolution it has right now. When it's rasterized, like the one I just copied, or like any of these other layers, if I make it tiny and then stretch it out to be big again, it's going to look pixelated and not very high res. So to demonstrate that, let's take both of these, and I'm just going to transform them down to be super small. I'll hit enter. Let's just say I thought that looked great yesterday. I come back to start working on this, and I wonder what the heck I was doing. Those are just so tiny, I need them big again. And I bring them back up to size. Our smart object looks great. Our rasterized object is just that tiny image stretched up. So you can keep that in mind as you're working if you need the flexibility of smart objects to be able to say, well, I think I want it this size, but I also want the safety to be able to come back and make it this size. You'll have that with a smart object. So let's transform this. We can also just use the move tool and click on it and hold. We're going to drag and drop it down to that lower left corner. Perfect. And it should snap in there. So as you get close, it should snap over and align in the corners. All right, so next, let's do this. Let's make our Hawaii text layer visible. So that should be second layer down, or it'll read Hawaii right here. And let's make this text more interesting. So we're going to go back, and similarly like we did here with this beach photo, we're going to add some layer styles to this text. So once again, you can add layer styles to normal image layers. You can add them to text layers. Any layer you should be able to add a layer style to. So with that, let's do this. If you right click on your Hawaii text layer you've got this little thumbnail to the left of where it says Hawaii. So right click on that and go to select pixels. It's going to make a selection based off of all the pixels that were there in that Hawaii layer. Now we're going to use a new tool here in it's called the gradient tool. So about halfway down on your tools panel. And you can see it should default to basics in this very first type of gradient. So you've got foreground to background color. You can see it matches my foreground to background color, blue and white down here. Foreground color to nothing, to transparent. So if I did that, it would go from blue to no effect. And then here, obviously, black to white. So we'll just go with that first option there. And then here you have another couple options. This is just going to be a straight gradient, so straight across to straight across. This is a radial one, so it'll go from blue to white in a circle. All kinds of other options you guys can play with. But let's do something different. So let's go with something bright and maybe kind of an orangey yellow. So let's see. Maybe something like that to start with. You can pick any of those colors you want or totally change the colors up. And let's do this. So our gradient here, we're going to click at the top with our gradient tool, drag down and let go at the bottom. And you can see it gives us a gradient from those two colors. So it's going from the orange to the white. Now you have control over this. So if I wanted to redo this, I could do just a tiny gradient and I'll get a really tight one. Or I can go even further beyond the text and get a much more subtle gradient. It's still changing, but my real orange is up here. My real white is down here where I clicked and dragged. We're seeing just part of that transition. So maybe I'll start at just a little bit above, a little bit below, and redo that real quick. So make sure you keep your selection. If you accidentally deselected, just come back over to Hawaii, right click on that thumbnail preview, and click select pixels again. No problem at all. You can jump right back to that. So let's do this. Let's actually, sorry I was wrong there. Let's go ahead and deselect. Let's save our work. So you should, now that we've saved once, just be able to hit Command S to save. Now let's go ahead and add some more text here. So if you click on your text tool and just come over here right next to Hawaii, right below the H, and if you just click, you should be able to go ahead and start typing. Yours may look different from mine. Working on other projects and things, I have different fonts that show up. We're going to go ahead and use Birch Standard. You can follow along with this to start with, and then later on if you want to, you can go ahead and change these fonts. So Birch Standard, we're going to change our font size to 36. So once again, we could just highlight 30 or whatever yours says and change that to 36 and hit enter. And then we're going to use a new text thing here that we haven't used before. So over in your properties panel, since we have the text layer or text tool and some text selected, we get different options obviously for text. So you'll see right here this VA with an arrow kind of left and right underneath it. As with everything else, we can click and drag back and forth to scrubby it. We can use any of these presets in the dropdown, or we can just type straight in. So I'm just going to highlight type straight in and change my tracking or the spacing between my letters out to 250. And then let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to highlight that and I'm going to change this color to a bright green. So that should work perfect. Once again, you can pick whatever colors you want. And let's go ahead and type island. Oops, I'm getting some glyphs there. So if you go ahead and type island paradise. Perfect. And I'm going to hit the check mark to confirm those changes. And then I'm just going to go to the move tool and just use my arrow keys to nudge that down a little bit so that I can see it below Hawaii there. So let's go back to the text tool real quick. And let's just continue to adjust this text. So we've got our gradient, we've got this, but it still feels kind of flat. It's still a little bit hard to read on this busy background here. So on our Island Paradise layer, we've got that selected. Make sure that layer is selected here in your panel. So let's go up to Layer and then Layer Style again. Another quick way to get there without going through this menu is to double click anywhere that's blank on the layer. So if I click over here on the thumbnail, it's going to select the text. If I click here where there's text on my layer, it's going to let me rename it. But if I double click anywhere out here, kind of an open space, it's going to pull up that layer style menu, and that's a nice quick shortcut there. So let's go ahead and add a drop shadow. So that's the very bottom option here. We'll just click the checkbox next to that to add a drop shadow, and if we click on where it says drop shadow, we get all different kinds of options to adjust how soft it is, how hard it is, how intense and dark it is, all those sorts of things. So we're going to start with an opacity of 75%. We're going to start typing these in. Our angle of 78 is great. Let's do a distance of 5 pixels. Let's do a spread of 30%. And lastly, let's do a size of 10 pixels, so just a little bit bigger than it was before. Oops, I typed 109. And if you want to, you can continue to adjust from there, and then let's just go ahead and hit OK. So once again, now you can see that we have effects added and kind of appended to this Island Paradise layer. So we can show and hide those with the eyeball, just like we can the entire layer. So if you had like 10 effects, you'd have 10 different eyeballs, 10 different effects, and you could turn them on and off to see what you liked best. So let's go ahead and add this same drop shadow effect to Hawaii. So let's do this. Rather than having to double click it and go through the menu and type in those same values, we can actually just copy these effects over. So for that, we're just going to hold Option on Mac or Alt on PC, click here, drag, and drop down to Hawaii. So you can either hold that and click on the effects and drop it down, or you can do it over here where it says FX on the right, drag and drop it down. And you can see now our Hawaii also has that same drop shadow added to it. So let's add one more effect to the Hawaii text here called a stroke, or that outline that we used before. So let's select our Hawaii layer right there, and you can double click effects. You can go up to layer style and add it. Once again, you can also double click anywhere here in the open space to pull up that menu. So once again, we're going to add a stroke. So we'll find stroke about 1/3 of the way down, check that box next to it, and it pops right up there defaulting to white. And we can adjust these here. So why don't we do a size of 4, and position, let's go outside so that we're not cutting into our letters at all. And then you can select a color of your choice. So I think I'm just going to match mine to my green of my paradise. So I'll just hover over my image and click anywhere that there's green. Once again, you can use the sliders or sample anywhere else you'd like to make your color change there. And once we're done with that, we can hit enter or hit OK. Let's do this. So let's keep adding some more layer effects. So let's go down to our flower number 2. And we're going to add a drop shadow, but I don't want it sort of as small and hard as this one is. So let's double click here to start working on a drop shadow that's kind of custom to the flower. So we'll add a drop shadow, and I'm just going to make it a little softer. So let's go up to the opacity, change that down just a little bit to 60. Let's do a distance of 13 pixels, so a little bit further away. A spread of 9%. And I think I'm actually going to make my size quite a bit larger just to soften it a little bit. So we kind of get a bigger, softer shadow there. So maybe something like 20, 24 pixels, something like that. So let's do this. Let's actually pump our flower up a little bit in color so it looks a little bit drab. So we're going to add an adjustment layer. Once again, our layers panel here is starting to get a little bit long. This is kind of the most complex one we've worked on. As we add these effects, you can see it's starting to take up space. Next to effects that are attached to each of these layers, you've got this up arrow. You can use that to expand and collapse those, so you don't have to see as much at once. But let's go ahead and add that hue saturation adjustment layer. So whether you add it up here, whether you add it down below, once again, I prefer down below just because I can read them. I know exactly where they are. So we'll go hue saturation. And in our properties here, let's adjust the color of the flower, and that's our hue slider. So let's just start dragging to the right and see what we like. So you can see this is affecting everything in the image, or everything that's below this effect or this adjustment layer. Let's not worry about that for now. Let's just focus on what it's doing to the flower. So let's keep bringing this up, and maybe somewhere around 42, 43 it gets a nice pink color. And then let's really pump up the color just a little bit and add 10 saturation to it. That'll give it just a little bit more of a boost. So that's great and all. It makes our flower look awesome, but everything else just looks terrible now. So the way to do this in a way that it only affects that flower is to add what's called a clipping mask. So if we right click, we would definitely want to make sure that this layer is organized right next to the layer we want to attach it to. So if it's for some reason up here, or there's layers in between that and the flower we want it on, make sure you move that adjustment layer so that it's right above the flower. Then let's right click on it, and you're going to pick Create Clipping Mask. It's just above halfway down, and you'll see it bumps over and it gets this little attachment, and now it's clipped to that layer and it's only going to affect that layer. Another way to do that is to hover between the layers, and let me undo. So if you hover between the layers and hold Option on Mac or Alt on PC, you'll see that my cursor changes to that sort of box with a down arrow. And if I keep holding that key and just click between the layers, I get a clipping mask that way as well. So just the shortcut there instead of right clicking and choosing it. So let's go ahead and save real quick. So let's just say that you're creating this from scratch rather than these kind of Photoshop lessons from the book that tell you, hey, use 36 size font, use this, use that. And you just kind of want to play around, see if you can make it look better or put it together in a way that you like. So let's revisit some of the tools and effects that we use and see what kind of updates we can do. So let's just go back to where it says Island Paradise. And if you click anywhere in there, you'll see that it takes, with that text tool, it takes you right in to edit any of this. So I'm just going to click in between the two words, and I'm just going to add of and see how that looks. Once again, I can use the move tool to either click, hold, and drag, or I can, not having to go too far, so I can use my arrow keys to nudge. And let's just say that I like that. I want it to say Island of Paradise, but I also liked how it was before, just to show you how it kind of lined up with the edges of Hawaii. So let's do this. If I select just by double clicking, should allow me to select everything. If it's kind of fighting you, you can hit Control A or Command A once you're in, and it should select everything. You can also just double click on the little thumbnail icon to the left of your text layer. If I double click that, it's going to take me right into edit, and I can adjust everything. And let's change that tracking. So remember we typed in 250. I'm just going to start bumping that down and see about what point it matches the width of Hawaii. So that may work. I think we need to go just a little bit bigger, so maybe 180. I'm going to click the move tool and just nudge it back over with my arrow keys, and I think that matches close enough. So about 180 was just about right. And let's go ahead and make just a few more changes. So if we turn on that postage layer, if you've had that turned off, let's adjust that. And let's move that down over here. And you may get lucky and have it work. Once again, you may miss and end up on your pineapple and end up moving that. So I tend to use transform rather than just clicking and moving. So once again, that's edit, free transform, or control or command T, depending on if you're Mac or PC. So we're just going to adjust and move that down somewhere like this and kind of run it off the side of our postcard there. So let's do one last thing. Let's add a border to this. So it kind of runs right off the edge. Let's add a quick white border. So let's add a blank layer right here at the top. So make sure you're at the very top layer of all your layers. Add a new blank layer. Once again, that's that little square with the plus next to the trash icon at the bottom of the layers panel. And let's drag this right up above the very top layer. And let's name it white border. And go up to the top and go select all. And you'll see it draws a selection around our entire image. Now we're going to do this. If you go up to select, modify, and we're going to use this selection to create a border. And we're going to do 10 pixels. So you may have to type in here and change this and hit OK. So now you can see that our selection has moved in just a little bit from the edge by 10 pixels, what we just told it to. And so this is kind of getting back to what we did on our first lesson, right? We've got a selection. On our first lesson, we painted with blue in order to create that ribbon. Rather than creating that by hand, painting forever, let's just right click. So I accidentally tried to move it when I did that, but let's just try this. So let's do this. I think if we, somehow it changed the layers for me. If you end up with anything funky like I just had, just click back up to your white border. And actually, let's just drop down for easiness sake. Click on the rectangular marquee since that's a selection tool. That should work better with this. And if you right click on your selection, we'll click fill halfway down. And we're going to fill with our background color since mine's white, or you can just choose white from the drop down and just hit OK. And then we'll deselect, either select and then deselect, or the keyboard shortcuts right there, Command D or Control D. So you can see we have our border. That's great. Just to make this a little bit more realistic, if this was a postcard that had been stamped, this stamp would be over the top of the border. So for that, we'll just rearrange our layers. We'll just bring our white border right below that stamp. So that looks just a little bit more realistic. So let's go ahead and save one last time here. And let's do this. The last step is to kind of add a shadow to our second flower, the one that we have hidden right now. So it's the reddish pink flower. And once again, we can just copy the shadow we added to our purple flower, since that one's a little different from our text. So once again, to see those effects, I can just use this arrow next to FX on that layer. And I can just hold Option and drag the effects up using the FX here to where you wouldn't need to expand it like I did, or you could click here and drag from there, and that should work. So now you can see it added our drop shadow there. That's kind of covering up our beach image, adding some depth, some shadow there. This isn't the most realistic, obviously, image, but kind of adds to it, makes it look a little bit nicer, a little bit more thought out. So let's save. So this is a great use of this panel. Once again, the status bar down here, and yours, if it's not set to document sizes, click that little arrow and choose document sizes. So this being the most complicated file we've worked with all these layers, all these different pieces, this is a handy tool here. So if we save this flattened, it's estimating that this is going to be about 2.3 megabytes. If I save this as a Photoshop document or a TIFF with all of my layers so that I can come back tomorrow or any day and open this up and change my green to blue or something like that, rearrange my layers, rethink it, it's going to be almost 18 times as large or bigger and be almost 40 megabytes. So just something to pay attention to, something to consider. Do I ever need to come back to whatever project I'm working on and be able to have that ability to make changes or not? You know, and you might consider storage space if you're on a laptop or something that maybe has less storage, also something to consider there. You can also play it safe if you think you're going to print this once save both, and then come back in a week or two and just delete what you don't need. All right, guys, thank you so much for taking my class, and hopefully this was helpful. Once again, reach out with any questions you may have in the future.